Every year since 1989, the Library of Congress has selected 25 films to add to the National Film Registry. The criteria? The films must be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant.
Each week on You're Missing Out, we take a look at one of these films to try and get to the heart of why they were selected and why they still matter.
This week, Josh Shepperd joins us to talk about The March of Time, Inside Nazi Germany.
Our guest today is an associate professor of media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder and sound fellow of the Library of Congress National Recording Preservation Board, where he is a researcher, but, crucially, not a voting member of the board. So don't send him any letters if you have any qualms or concerns about some of the choices. What he does there is he directs the Audio Preservation Task Force and Sound Submissions Project. But today, Josh Shepperd is here with us to talk about The March of Time Inside Nazi Germany. Josh, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
We are so excited to have you here. The reason I invited you on initially is you published a book several probably years ago now, right? Has it been a number of years? Called Shadow of the New Deal: The Victory of Public Broadcasting, which was, I don't know, it's been a couple years now, I think, since that book came out, right?
It's been 2 years.
2 years, right? And I forget how it came on my radar, but I bought it. I read it. It received a number of book awards. I think like 5 book awards, which might well have been how it came on my radar, or you might just have had a tweet go viral and I found it there. Either of those things is possible in this world. But I really enjoyed it. I had the distinct pleasure of, I will say, folks should pick up the book, but if you are going to read it, my recommendation is do what I did, which is read a portion of it while sitting on FDR's lawn. That was a very cool thing to get to do. Up in
Something everybody is easily able to do. So,
just
setting the bar very low for people.
Listen, if you're in New York, it's only a 2.5 hour drive. You can you can make
only
it work.
a 2.5 hour drive.
You can make it work. It's a fun day trip. But I was a great fan of the book, and when I knew we had this coming up on the show, I was like, let me take a shot in the dark, see if we could get you on, and you were very gracious enough to say you would come join us to talk about it. So I'm so grateful you agreed to this.
It's my pleasure, truly.
It's so we should talk a bit before we even get started on the March of Time, and there's a lot to talk about with the March of Time. But let's talk a little bit, if it's all right. You were speaking to us a little bit off mic about the distinctions between the National Recording Preservation Board and the National Film Registry and the preservation efforts versus kind of the voting process. So I'd love if you could give a bit of insight into what specifically you do with regards to audio preservation and your work there.
Sure, yeah. So I'm the sound fellow of the Recording Board, which is kind of the mirror or sister group of the Film Board. And so I think in short, what I do is I get people to work together to solve problems in preservation, curation, and access. And there are so many problems with radio in particular in this country, and the sort of benign neglect that led to us losing really most of the history of audio that came out of mass media from the past, 70, 80 years of recorded sound. So what the boards do is that they promote and they frame American history of media for a broader public. And they do that so that they can be essentially canonized by federal institutions. And then there's all kinds of different things that change in terms of access when that happens. So when the Library of Congress makes these decisions with boards, they take these experts who are very great experts on both boards. They ask them about what they think was most important about these histories, be it a film or be it a song. Sometimes it's non-commercial or like documentary audio for the Recording Board. And then they make the vote. And then after the vote, the materials kind of become more available for people, and some of the access rules changed just a little bit. And so what's happening in the process is essentially as much a discourse about copyright as it is about just celebrating cultural history. So along the way, the library is one of the top 3 public research institutions in the country for history and for other types of culture as well. So you'd have like the Wilson Center, which is a Smithsonian, and the Library of Congress, and then there's some other ones depending on who you talk to. What the library does too is it promotes the study of histories so that they can be preserved. And so part of the boards include kind of like developing collaborative frameworks by which the culture doesn't just exist and can be accessed, but it can be put to work. And so that's my job. So my job is essentially to learn the policies, know the people who are working out there in different subject areas, and then know the state of the union of different cultural artifacts like radio, and then figure out what kinds of work or research we need to apply so that these histories can be preserved in the first place. So it's kind of like a symbiosis between the recognition of the cultural history, the preservation, and then public knowledge, but also the engines that make them continuous public knowledge. So I could keep going for a while. But then it gets pretty dry. Like I get people to publish in journals together. I get people to conference together. We study policies for long hours and talk about them. Those kinds of things.
So one of the things that I think is interesting, particularly how it applies here when you're discussing radio, and its evolution, is that the film we're talking about today, something I didn't necessarily realize, is how much the genesis of the March of Time is, for a lot of people, kind of in the DNA of all televised news and what we would call a visual news media. But how much the March of Time essentially stemmed from a couple of guys with movie cameras going, we should do something like radio news but for the movies. I didn't necessarily realize that was sort of where this began. That that the March of Time was already a radio news program, and nobody was necessarily thinking of doing that same kind of serious journalism at the movies. And now I think, I wonder, maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I would have said that it has flip-flopped, right? And people now think of like visual storytelling as the premier art form for, audio reporting and things like that. And yet now, and I'd imagine this had to be for you specifically, and your field of study and the work that you do, seeing sort of in the last decade or so the rise of, and maybe glut of, the investigative podcast and just podcasts in general. Do you see that as something of sort of this medium sort of returning to some of its roots in a way, or do you see this as kind of a next step in its evolution? And mind you, when you answer that, remember you're on a podcast currently, so if you want to talk up this medium, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I mean, I love podcasting. I don't think podcasting is a one-to-one continuation of radio, but I think there's a lot of what we'd say like the aesthetic form of radio within a lot of podcasting. And especially as I'm talking to you, a show like this does feel like a radio show that's being podcasted. I think one of the 2 or 3 things that make podcasting so prescient and why it's so just uniquely popular, number one, the specificity of the conversation. There's no research and development that needs to identify a niche audience. One can make content, tag it with metadata, and then the audience finds it because they're already implicitly interested. And so no audience is too small for podcasting, which I love. So anyone can just talk to each other and join a community to think about things. And I think that's probably the biggest attraction. But number 2, I think, podcasting has this way that radio understood as early as the late 1920s of you could do 2 or 3 things at once. It doesn't require you to tune in so fully that you're going to miss something. You can actually be completely immersed in audio and do whatever else it could be. In the old days, it had a gendered dimension of enforced domesticity, right? They actually would shape programs around the expected behaviors, like, for example, at home for women. So the kinds of programs you would hear and the origins of certain types of talk shows or quiz shows or game shows would have been built around the assumed behaviors of an audience. And then in the evening, it was prestige time, and then they would have drama and stuff, and we would all tune in. But I think just the idea that we do implicitly understand that audio can accompany you is another reason that podcasting has its own life, and then the third reason is what I said a moment ago, which is that you can kind of experiment with it because it's not like 3 or 4 corporations trying to recoup investments on programs for advertisers alone. So anyone can do a podcast whoever they want, and I think that kind of either formality or looseness, is actually the attraction. Is that it's actually kind of exciting to not know what's coming, whereas a lot of TV and other types of media are mostly derivative in how they're aesthetically structured.
I appreciate that answer. That being said, you saying there's no audience too small. I mean, I think the one thing we can all agree on is doing a podcast about a 1930s, 1940s movie news serial that is largely inaccessible, I think is going to rake in millions upon millions of listeners. I think that's as broad as you can get in terms of content. So I don't think we're worried about that, quite frankly.
Right.
Yeah, this is going to be our Jupiter ascending.
I want to get into specifically the March of Time a little bit, because I think one of the things that's fascinating about it is, for the most part, these ran for many years. This newsreel for 16 years, every month, 4 hours a year, 20 minutes an episode, and yet most of them now are extraordinarily difficult to find if you can watch them at all. And in spite of that, I feel like every one of us, when we sat down to watch this, it felt instantly familiar. Did you guys have that experience?
Yeah, I definitely had that experience because this is going to be one where we're not going to be questioned about. Tell me your experiences with Inside Nazi Germany. Don't have them. Only watched it for this. So, but yeah, it really did feel very familiar. I'm sure a lot of it had to do with knowing the content within through all the historical, history classes, books, what have you I've read, and all of that stuff. But just also a lot of like how it informed, like Mike said earlier, the way news today, once TVs became a thing, and then 24-hour news became a thing, and it just started becoming a thing and not just something you saw at the movies, once a week. It's also just kind of like the go-to parody of like what a news, like how many movies or TV shows where it's like like making fun of this kind of, not even making fun of, but using it to sort of like joke around of like, hey, this is what the news was like, and you had guys with that kind of voice doing this, and the one, I'm sure everyone of my generation
someone's going to bring it up at some point. I wanted to know which one of the three of us was going to bring it up.
Yeah, everyone of our generation we could probably look at anybody and just go, the March of War, eat snacky smalls. South Park doing that stuff all the time, especially in the movie. It's just one of those things, this is an interesting episode because it's like not a movie, and it's not even like a documentary. It's a segment of the news, and it's journal. It's like this weird thing. So it's like, it's weird. It has it. You see, why it's in the registry because of one, that the subject it's discussing. World War II became a big topic of interest in the 90s, but also just it's one of the most it influenced everything. I mean, it's probably hard to say this one specifically, maybe, but like this whole sort of thing, this newsreel before the movies, its tendrils are everywhere. So, like, this before you even watch it, like what you're gonna get. Basically, it's like, all right, I know what this is gonna sound like, what it's gonna look like. Really, the only thing that I'm not gonna know is exactly when and where they start and stop each little segment within. But otherwise, yeah, this is like, yeah, I've seen this. Yeah, like, okay, great.
Yeah, it totally has these, formal characteristics that have been spoofed, repeated, in a number of ways. And I think one of the things I was noting, I rewatched it obviously for this discussion, is that it's basically a piece of successful propaganda that is appearing as news. And at the same time, it feels like it could have gone much further, denouncing the Nazis, right? Which is what gives it kind of the veneer of journalism, and in a way, it is journalism. Because 38's pretty much, stuff's pretty bad already by 38 over there, and it seems like they even seem to censor some of the things that were happening over there and the brutalities. So, and what I found was they really homed in on this idea that what Hitler did was repeat slogans, repeat them again, over and over again, and then they themselves kind of did that in the reel. The reel was also a repetition of slogans with some other characteristics we'll get to talking about today. But the idea that repetition of ideology is more powerful than like truth or democracy or any kind of public discourse is really strongly stated within that piece, and perhaps to some extent learned from it for the piece, which I thought was kind of a fascinating historical juncture.
So this gives us, I think this discussion today, we're going to have an opportunity to talk both about what this represents in terms of, as you said, war propaganda, and also what this represents as what they called pictorial journalism. We're talking about both the March of Time in its broadest sense, its 16-year legacy, and also this particular film and its significance. But before we get into any of that ourselves, let's talk about what the Library of Congress had to say about it. So here's what the National Film Registry had to say about the March of Time inside Nazi Germany.
The March of Time, Inside Nazi Germany. This edition of the popular newsreel series concentrates solely on Nazi Germany, its propaganda machine, discrimination against Jews, youth indoctrination, and increasing militarization. It persuasively criticizes the regime, but often through unethical methods not uncommon at the time. Stock footage was edited out of context, events were reenacted or fabricated, and voiceovers misrepresented the images depicted. While this newsreel fuels anti-Nazi sentiment, its manipulative approach perpetuated a journalistic movement that valued sensationalism over reality.
So that's what, that's how they summarized the March of Time inside Nazi Germany. I should stress that's also how they summarized it in the 90s, which is one of those, I think, interesting things. And Josh, I say this is, in other work, I write about kind of world history, and obviously you've written a book involving the New Deal and covering this particular era of history. I do think it's interesting how the way that we talk about American propaganda and kind of Western actions or Allied actions during World War II from a historical standpoint, I feel like is always kind of tinged by whatever's going on in the world at that time. I always feel like there's this thing of like, whenever it starts to feel like there's some fascism on the rise in Europe again, we kind of taper down how much we're going, how should we have conducted ourselves in our wartime propaganda? Should we have used less recreations? I feel like that's very much a perspective, getting into the full nature of like, were we too propagandistic with this film? I think that tends to our analysis decreases as we're more like, oh no, things are a little dicey now. I think it's interesting how it kind of fluctuates how we respond to our own wartime efforts in World War II. But I don't know if you feel that's the case as well.
So me or
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I think so. Okay, so propaganda. One of the things that my book talks about is the accidental discovery of the relationship between demography and behavior based upon media. That's chapter 4 of the book. So, because they were trying to figure out if educational media was actually effective at educating so that they could address what they thought was a problem with a policy. And so they wanted to know, well, how do we change the policy without evidence? And they actually, at the time, did not have evidence of how to understand audiences. So some of the problems in early radio policy led to the invention of modern political science, communication, and sociological research, sort of both by necessity and accident. So where I'm going with that is that, the first discovery that they made was that there's a direct correlation between stimuli, which we just call content at this point. It could be sound or vision, and behavior. And then there was a second factor, which was not just that there is a correlation between how we're stimulated and then think or act, but that we refer to a kind of a group think. So it could be your pastor, right? It could be your family. But we always pivot ourselves, not just in a reaction, but in a contextual reaction to information. And what they realized was that this could be really good for advertising. That was one of the things they realized it could be good for. You could predict audience behaviors based upon advertising cues. But the other thing they realized immediately, and it was right around 1938, actually, it was almost identical in time, and this was coming out of New York and Princeton at the time, was that you could also change political judgment based upon how the content is delivered. So I think, when we're looking at these questions, there's two things that's happening. One is that, the Nazis are like the worst thing ever. And there was a lot of provincialism at the time and a lot of resistance to going to war. And so propaganda was, instituted by 1940-41 in order to mobilize the population around the war. Used a lot of racial tropes, that we would find very offensive today and should, of course. But then there's also this other discovery that it actually is identical to advertising, essentially. Propaganda is basically just advertising research that was discovered at the same time. And so the issues are usually like, okay, if you can stimulate people to behave certain ways by correlating their understanding of what they're receiving in terms of information with what they perceive to be their affiliation, so who their peoples are, right? Then you actually have a problem for democracy, right? So propaganda is always problematic because it's always a kind of manipulation of one's understanding to one's relationship to their surroundings and even to themselves. So I think the question is like, well, how much further could we have gone, or was it necessary? I would say in the case of the Nazis, we had to we had to do something. I think that's kind of an obvious thing. They were doing other types of things, like public forums were created around that time in which people were getting in big town halls and talking to each other about their problems. But then on the other hand, the propaganda question is always, did we also kind of like start something that we'll never be able to stop? Are we like in the propaganda bubble now by which we can never have an authentic relationship to ourselves again through media?
Well, I think that's really kind of the big, one of the most fascinating questions to ponder when watching this newsreel, this piece of propaganda, is the propaganda question, which is, Josh said it, which is like, yeah, well, we did have to do something about this Nazi problem, and having read Congressman Mrazek's book recently, and also now having, just because of Bob's book, I'm reading a James Ellroy novel, so I'm sort of like in like getting a lot of context and information, sort of getting back into that world. I've read a lot of stuff about that era, but like, getting back into that time where even in 37, 38, people knew what was, for the most part, going on. They knew bad things were happening. Maybe not the scope, maybe not the organized evil of a lot of it, but they knew bad shit was going on. But there's a large swath of the country that just straight up didn't care. Anti-Semitism was almost just like part and parcel of American experiences at the time. Like, people just really didn't care, like, that anything, like, oh, we were just in a war 20 years ago, we're gonna go kill millions of more of our kids for those Jews, and you go like, okay. So the people in power, knowing that doesn't just mean that the Jews are in trouble, that this is going to actually extrapolate into bigger problems than just one ethnic group. It's going to be a problem for everybody that's not, the master race. So it's like, okay, we got to do something. Maybe if we have to fudge the facts a little bit, be a little sensationalistic, maybe that's okay. And then that leads us to the question, like we said, is it a good thing in the end? Was there maybe a more effective way of doing it without opening that Pandora's box that we are, still living in, essentially, of, we don't really have news media anymore. We have propaganda media. It's almost kind of like reminds me of, what made Oppenheimer so interesting to me, which is that the whole movie is basically saying, like, yeah, we kind of had to do it because if the Nazis did it first, that would be worse. But now that we're in the world where we stopped the Nazis and the Japanese, we can't put this away. Is this actually going to be a good thing in the long run, no matter who or whatever made it first? Basically a question that kind of just can't be answered, because it's like, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't in this sort of scenario. And that's always sort of a fascinating thing in a world where so many people want to live in shades of black and white, where I tend to be like, I don't know, man, the world's a lot grayer than we want to acknowledge. And this is kind of the perfect example of that.
Well, I mean, one thing that we haven't addressed yet that makes this film significant, beyond its relation in the March Term and anything like that, is this is the first major Hollywood film of any kind to be explicitly anti-Nazi. And that is a big deal, right? And so when we are talking about how this film depicts Nazi Germany, how it addresses Nazi Germany, we have to remember it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't exist as, well, prior to this film, the American public was not being told how to feel about Nazi Germany at all. Very much the opposite. The films, there were independent films being produced to one degree or another that were critical of the Nazi government, but mainstream Hollywood films, the stuff that was going out to 13,000 theaters, were being told to specifically censor the content they were making so that these films could still be distributed in Nazi Germany. And Goebbels and the propaganda wing of Germany was inviting journalists and photojournalists and news media to Berlin to see the new, beautiful, improved Berlin. And that's what kind of makes this film so striking to watch, is that when it begins and it's, showing you lovely Berlin and its cafes and the people going to work, you're like, it tricks you into thinking it's going to be yet another one of these newsreels, these softball newsreels going, and look at how lovely Berlin is after the war. And instead, just explicitly calling out, like, it looks like the stuff that we were shown looks like this because the Nazis want us to see this. And this is a show, and this is, and this is a trick, this is a deception. And explicitly calling that out is not just an editorial choice on their part. That is a deliberate reaction to all of the content that the average American has previously received about Nazi Germany, which is not just uncritical, but fawning. And, the reality of it is, this is a huge problem that doesn't just exist then; it continues. There are so many stories of journalists and scholars being invited out to these totalitarian countries and being shown the prettiest side of things, and just reporting that as fact. That continues. I mean, I still, I mean, listen, I know plenty of people, friends of mine who are journalists, who will just get pitches all the time of like, come take this trip to country X. We'll show you how great it is for tourism. And you go, country X is just doing a lot of horrific things. And if you go along and you take the pictures they want you to take, you're participating in greenwashing this nation. In inside Nazi Germany, this is the March of Time, which at this point is not that old an institution. It only begins in 1935. 3 years in, it is deliberately and very consciously pushing back against all of the pro-Nazi narrative that has spread throughout the populace. So I think while we talk about the propaganda elements of it, it is important to, I think, stress that this exists in opposition to a type of thought toward Nazi Germany that, because of the censorship that had existed in Hollywood prior to that, the average American was not necessarily receiving all of the accurate information about the horrors of Nazi Germany. We knew some of the things for sure, but like, there were a lot of things that people were not allowed to say necessarily. So I think when we talk about it, we have to view it in contrast to the other films of the era as well.
Yeah, and just, like I said, it's people like maybe weren't getting the exact news, the exact details, but most of the country was pretty well aware something was going on in Europe. By also things were getting a little frisky over there in Asia with the Japanese. They didn't necessarily know the details. They didn't want to know the details because, irregardless of whether the Nazis were being portrayed a little favorably in the media, they just wanted nothing to do with it. They literally, the country was just like, that's not for us. We just dealt with this crap. This is for people that aren't our people, and just leave us alone. It's for people we deem lesser, and this does feel like, okay, maybe we have to play a little dirty pool here with what we're doing in terms of getting the proper message across. They had to do it because this wasn't just a case of like, oh, the communists are in Korea, so we got to make a big deal about this, even though, well, why is this our problem? This is like, no, these fuckers are, destroying their country while making it seem like they're not, so they can take over the world. And, I don't know if you guys know this, but we are also a part of the world. They will come for us too, you ignorant bastards. Take note. Like, just because we went through something bad 20 years ago doesn't mean you need to let something bad happen again. And as much as it's not as in your face about what was actually happening, it's giving you enough of a poke in the ribs to be like, this is bad. I know you guys think this isn't bad because it's happening to people not near you, but this is bad, and we can't let this continue unabated. We need to be aware of this, which is always kind of like not funny, but funny in the fact that they were making this effort, but then it was Japan that got us into the war, which is just one of the comical, like, you can't write these things about history.
I mean, I think too, as we're talking about how the information is presented, and Josh, I hope you can speak to this a bit. One of the things that struck me watching this is I wouldn't necessarily describe it as the most all-encompassing portrait of the horrors of Nazi Germany, but I do think it's interesting that this seems to be curating the information it provides toward what would most outrage the average American in 1938. There is so much talk about you're not allowed to strike or ask for a raise. The average worker doesn't realize what he's paying for his security. Every radical and known liberal is in prison, hiding, or dead. So it seems like it's aimed, and I feel like that occurs a lot in wartime propaganda. But I was wondering if, as we talk about like how it presents Nazi Germany, and you especially mentioning this idea of it could have gone further, it could have gone where, how did you feel, especially as being a focus of yours, of how this sort of curated the information it was presenting and what its kind of goal was in doing so?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. When I watch these things, I of course watch for the content and what's said, and I actually made notes for exactly what you just said in terms of the representations. But I also kind of look at what they're doing with like the camera and the editing, and I think like there's like kind of a masterful way in which this frames things and it kind of has a feeling of movement forward that it brings you with it in terms of the ideology. So like what does that mean? So you mentioned stock footage. It's kind of like a narrator with some B-roll, right? That's like basically you can't tell where it's from. You don't know when. You don't know what it's of. They say like Berlin and Nuremberg, a couple times, but that's about it. But it's essentially kind of a non-locational, ultra-locational focus in terms of what you're seeing, and then you're being told how to feel about what you're seeing at the same time. And so, and then from the fact that it did feel like a B-roll kind of just stock footage, just kind of flow of information, it becomes kind of more like a montage at some point. And I was noticing that the editing was kind of more like a jump cut form. Like it almost reminded me of Godard when I was watching it, in that like there's no real clear transitions. It's more like a Russian formalist approach or something like an Eisensteinian approach where you get like an establishment shot followed by sharp contrasts in light and dark, or an individual to a group. You get movement to static, and it just kind of keeps pumping away like at those contrasts, and it kind of never stops. And so, if I'm thinking about like how do they build not just the narrative, but what we'd call story world, so what is not shown that you then presume in what you're seeing? Where does the imagination take over in the process of what you're seeing? Is you get this sense of like everyday life, like this normalcy in these banal scenes, but as a kind of like abjection or excess in the face of a rising fascism. And in that way, it's kind of like a very brilliant movie, like that you have these very, for the time already, very conventional formal decisions that are being made with cameras and editing. But, you have these banal scenes, and then you have the Nuremberg marches. Mm-hmm. And then you have them having dinner together, and then Nuremberg marches, and then one of the interesting turns in that was they begin to punctuate these montage-like depictions with images of comics, of maps, of like churches, which are great works of art in Europe, of course, and here, but especially in Europe, state newspapers, what's happening with like different censorship groups that are looking at different papers and how they treat information, and so, the more that you watch this, the more of a conclusion that you come to, that this is with scare quotes, so like these people live differently than we do. And so like, what's the one time that you get people talking in the flow? Did you guys catch that? Like, when do they actually have someone talk within it?
Well, there's a reenactment of the German soldier coming and collecting donations from the girl, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then when we get the American town hall meetings,
mm-hmm.
which is such a phenomenal inclusion, I think.
So that's right. Yeah. And then you get the ambassador, for a moment,
yes.
who's reading very poorly, I want to say, in that scene.
Yes.
But the contrast is with Christians at a public forum. Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. Saying like, this is not what America is about. And then having that conversation. Otherwise, it's completely instrumentalized content.
And I think, I'm sorry, if I may, I think the other thing to point out with that I think is so interesting, and I want to make sure we touch on, they include not just them talking at their forums, but they include a woman who says, now I respect the old Germans. right? I respect the old way of Germany. This is not the old German way. It's not, it's very pointedly including that one moment as though to kind of convey to people like, hey, if you are a German, if you know Germans, these Nazis are a different thing. This is different than like the Germans you know down the street, which I thought was such an interesting way to contrast that with the German American Bund stuff that they show a little earlier, right?
Yeah, and they conclude the whole 15-minute reel with that discussion about how it's kind of like an invasion of home, with 200,000 enrolled in summer camps, Nazi summer camps. There's like 25 of them, and I was almost remembering like Indiana Jones, when you show how he's like flying from point to point, because they're showing all these points in the movement in the first Indiana Jones, and which has Nazis in it.
Yeah,
it's the main character. So, but like the way that they use the maps, which are a form of abstraction. It's not actually a depiction of how people live at all. It's not even actually a depiction of spatiality as we experience it within the country. It seems like a totalizing invasion of a space that we abstractly identify with, which speaks back to how that research of the time was understanding how audiences then adjudicated about what they were seeing, which is through their affiliations.
And I think it's so interesting, you say that about the abstraction, because when I'm watching it, I see one of those swastikas representing one of the 25 Nazi summer camps. And when you look at it on that map that's so far out, you go, my God, to me, I looked at them and, my God, that makes it look like it's so close to where I live now. There's no way that's true. And then I Google it, and it turns out, Camp Siegfried was actually about 40 minutes from where I live, which is real distressing to find out, to be honest.
Well,
did not know about that there was a Nazi summer camp in Long Island in Yaphank.
Well, that doesn't
strange.
necessarily surprise me much because, the Klan was out here for a while.
Yeah.
A lot more recently than you would think. So, Long
Yeah,
Island, great for the for the whites.
I do think it's one of those things where it's like, one of the things you watching it, and why the inclusion of those community forums is so important is, I don't think we're at a point now. It's less so, less so than I'd like. But I don't think we're at a point now where the American people are fully unaware of what was going on with the Nazis in Europe. But I do think the average American is very unaware of the activities of the German American Bund, right? The average American probably does not know who George Lincoln Rockwell was, right?
Oh,
They
I don't think
how
the
close this was.
I don't think
to
the average
seeping
American
into
knows
our-
any of this. I don't think they would
Yeah.
know a single thing, because if you
Which
even just told them that there was a gigantic sold out Nazi rally at MSG in the 30s, they would be like, "Oh my God, what?" And then you start getting into all of the other stuff, they'd be like, "No, you're making it up. Fake news."
Well, that's like, that was that terrific doc short. I forget how long ago it was, like 10 years ago. I'm assuming you caught that when it was around, Josh. A Night at the Garden. Did you see that one?
I have not.
Oh, look it up. It's only like 14 minutes long. Some filmmaker tracked down all of the archival footage of the Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden. And it is like, this thing was made on like Final Cut Pro, and it's just footage of the Nazi rally at the Garden interspersed with like basic text. And it's one of the most affecting things I've seen in a long time. When we talk about this film, and Josh, especially you talking about the filmmaking aspects of it, I'm going to talk a little bit, if it's all right, about just how the March of Time as a whole came to be, because I did not realize the genesis of this. I alluded to it a bit, but it begins with a guy named Louis de Rochemont. Louis de Rochemont was a fan of the radio series The March of Time, which was produced by Time Inc. And so he was listening to The March of Time on the radio and thinking, this would be a great format for a movie newsreel. Because at the time, when you went to the movies, they did have newsreels that they ran, but they were not particularly informational. Newsreels back then would be like footage of baby parades, right? Or dog shows. And they would be paired with those kind of like Pete Smith cutesy infotainment shorts, right? They were not serious, hard-hitting journalism. De Rochemont makes a pilot, essentially, a pilot film of his own, and calls it The March of the Year. He sells it to Columbia, but this thing makes the rounds, and somebody finally just goes to Time Inc. with this newsreel, this experimental newsreel that de Rochemont made, and went, this guy did something. You guys should just make this. Like, this should just be yours. You should do the March of Time in theaters. So Henry Lewis over at Time at the time calls up de Rochemont and basically tells him, I'm going to give you $1,500. Make something. Like, there's no oversight here. There's nothing. Just like, make me a thing. Show me what you're thinking. And then I will give you a small team and you will just get to make newsreels for Time. The reason that these things are so powerful in a way is because Time, was a hugely significant and powerful media institution, but the movies themselves didn't really have much impact on their income. So they, unlike the major Hollywood studios, Time was perfectly fine going, we're going to set aside a budget, we're going to get movie people, and we're going to trust them to make movies the way they think movies should be made. And we're going to give them a budget to experiment. And so when you look at how the March of Time innovates, and when you look at like how they editorialize, a lot of that has to do with the fact that instead of being beholden to, say, 20th Century Fox, they are an outlet of Time, which is a news publication and is mostly focused on its print output and its radio output. So there isn't the same level of editorial interference, and there isn't the same level of kind of fear of placating certain moneyed interests as there would be if there was a major Hollywood studio backing them. That means they start to play around. That means they start to do things like reenactments. There's a lot of reenactment footage in their work. Some of that has to do with them wanting to more effectively communicate a message. Some of that also has to do with the fact that, as they pointed out in this, I was watching a 1974 documentary about the March of Time called 4 Hours a Year, and one of the older gentlemen in it who had worked on the March of Time basically points out, he goes, do you know why we did a bunch of reenactments? Because, I hear from young people today about why didn't you do cinema verite? And what I tell them is, do you know how heavy the cameras were? Which I think is a valid point as well, is you didn't have the option of taking the camera and going to film these things the way you could, 10, 20, 30 years later. As the documentary said, nowadays, anybody who wants to make a film has a portable 16 millimeter camera and portable audio tape recording. And I sure know that's how I make all my films now, is 16 millimeter and portable audio tape.
Well, listen, there's nothing more enjoyable and reliable and relaxing than shooting on film and editing said film. I think that's the reason why the world today is just ready to explode, is that not enough people are getting their hands on actual film prints and editing them together. All of this digital shit, this Final Cut, pish posh. We need to go back to the analog days of wanting to rip our own eyeballs out because, oh great, Michael Cimino wants to re-edit this fucking movie again.
The odds of Riefenstahl like renting out the retambulator too for the large establishment shots was pretty low, I think, too, for that moment.
It's interesting. Yeah. Well, no, it's what you saying all of that is, the backstory of it and everything. Maybe this is a weird comparison, but that sounds almost exactly like what the film industry kind of went through with the experimenting on shorter form things, music videos in the 80s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, how many guys nowadays, maybe less more so now than, because music videos are just like not a thing anymore, really, or at least with no budget, so people can't experiment. But how many filmmakers came out in the 90s and the 2000s and, people at the time complaining about the MTV movies and all of that. And, I think a lot of that was, Fincher would even say, like, I'll do music videos or commercials because it'll let me experiment with this new camera or this new technology or this new editing software, what have you. And, just another, I don't know, just again, the way the history of the art form sort of folds in on itself and repeats itself is interesting to me.
And one of the things that I think is important about that too is, and this will bring us back to the idea of, the inside Nazi Germany and all that, but they talk a lot in this documentary about the relationship to truth, right? And they talk about, one of the editors who worked on the March of Time says, the truth of yesterday is different than the truth of today. He says, the March of Time communicated to the public of then effectively. There are more effective ways to communicate now, but that was the more effective way to communicate then. And he does say we were probably more freewheeling and our personal opinions entered into the discussion more than a traditional journalist would do now. But he also draws the comparison to somebody like Edward R. Murrow during the McCarthy hearings, where, maybe the traditional rules of journalism would say, don't infuse your own opinions into this. Don't try and put your finger on the scale. And yet we look at what Murrow did during the McCarthy hearings, and that was important, as we will discuss when we cover Point of Order later this season. We look at these moments where somebody needs to step up and say something and speak something. The March of Time did that. And to be clear, they didn't just do that for Nazi Germany. When I watched this doc, I was shocked to discover that they did a series of newsreels, absolutely decrying Huey Long, like calling him a tin pot dictator and everything, which was really shocking to see them do. And one other quote I pulled, just because I want to note that they said it, they showed a clip of a newsreel about Trujillo that the March of Time did, wherein they describe him. This is a direct quote from the March of Time. They describe Trujillo as the most dictatingest dictator who ever dictated.
It's a lot of dictating.
That sounds like something somebody would tweet now, not something that appears in a 1930s newsreel. But I was a little taken aback.
Drunk.
Yeah, right. But
it's not even quite alliteration.
No.
He dictated the most dictating dictators things.
Yeah.
Yeah, man.
God bless him. God bless him. But yeah, I think that to loop it back to the. Sorry, you were saying, Tom?
Well, no, because you connecting it to the Edward R. Murrow thing and about how the questions of ethics of journalism and whatnot, and like putting your opinion to tilt the scales of the story you're telling it in one side or the other. It is an interesting discussion, but at the same time, that there are, with stuff like this, where sometimes tilting the scale is really just another way of saying exposing the truth. Edward R. Murrow was just laying it out there. It may have been, quote unquote, his opinion, but he basically was just saying, this is what's happening, and based on XXX, there's this fucking clip I keep seeing on Instagram, and I can't remember where it's from, but it just makes a point that I think is related to this, where it's about journalism, and it's a producer is going, if it's your job to ask two people if it's raining, and if one person says yes and the other person says no, you don't quote both of them. You stick your head out the window and see if it's fucking raining. And I think that's sometimes journalists, can maybe convince themselves that telling the truth is having an opinion, or being afraid of, being considered partisan. And, I don't think there's any argument here that this movie's not propaganda, and that these guys are definitely certainly trying to get their views of what's going on across. But at the same time, sometimes you land on the truth, even if it's your opinion. And that's just one of the slippery discussion points of journalism and stuff like this, where you sort of start taking into account, all right, maybe a little slippery what you guys are doing here, but you're also not wrong. You're also not wrong, which is, again, like, the conversations aren't necessarily something you can sort of stop having. These are things that you keep talking about because, we're living in this shit now, man. It's not over.
Josh, I was hoping you could. I wanted to ask specifically, if I may, and if you don't want to weigh in on this, you're welcome not to. But this film doesn't just utilize archival footage or anything like that. It does include a number of reenactments, right? Now, when we talk about nonfiction filmmaking, I don't want to necessarily just use the term documentary because one gentleman in this documentary, the documentary 4 Hours a Year, talking about the history of the March Time, says emphatically that they are not making documentaries, that they consider documentary a dirty word and called themselves pictorial journalists instead. He says, a journalist goes out with his notepad and pen. We go out with our cameras. Our notes are all written in silver and celluloid, which is exactly the kind of quote you would get from a very old man in the 1970s. It's incredible. But I do want to talk a bit about particularly reenactments and their role, not just in this, but you're talking, your focus is in studying media and studying the evolution of ideas and things like that. The role that reenactments play in nonfiction filmmaking, from these March of Time newsreels through to the furor around something like The Thin Blue Line decades later, into filmmaking now and the glut of not just reenactment footage, but people even using kind of artificial intelligence to recreate voices of the dead and things like that. What do you kind of, just from your vantage point and your scholarly vantage point, our relationship to creating images of a truth in this way, whether it be reenactments or recreations, things like that, like, what do you feel about its role in films like The March of Time in their era, and what do you feel about it sort of now in nonfiction filmmaking?
Yeah, so I mean, verite does try to address the depiction of truth somewhat, and then there's still contrivance and craft, right? Within verite, this has been discussed pretty widely. And then, of course, I just wrote a piece for like some Oxford Handbook of Documentary or something like that. But what it's about, how do we even license B-roll, which I mentioned before. And so you actually don't even have access to all the stock footage you need to reproduce a situation, or it's constrained by estate claims or the licensure fees. And sometimes licensing like short segments of something costs more than the entire production values of a documentary, which then hurts the documentary from reproducing the actual artifact or images that it's talking about. So this is what we call political economy. So it's not just when you're seeing an image, it's not just is it true or not, but like what are the industrial conditions or the technological conditions or even the access conditions, which I think everyone would understand, that make it possible to do one thing or another. And so, messaging in itself is never fully reliable as like a manifestation of a phenomenon or an encapsulation of like a true encounter that one would then interpret one way and only one way. But to make it a little less abstract, while I was watching the film, one thing I was noticing is there are repeated images back to Nazi offices, propaganda offices, and how cordial it all and clean it all looks, the health and efficiency thing, right?
Yeah.
And then the juxtapositions are to those family situations and cafes, but the cordiality of the worst things being planned to the everyday life and how it repeats that over and over again. And then you find out that some of that was enacted, but it really is pretty effective. It's saying like they will equally sign a piece of paper that will send a number of people to their death as they will have a coffee afterwards in Berlin or something like that. It's the same for them in what we'd call, a graphic match, or graphic relation, depending on the scene. So the way in which they've blocked the screen is identical based upon if it's the worst thing or the average thing that we all do at home anyway. I think that's pretty damning if it worked, and I think it did, obviously, to feel a kind of like horror or even like a kind of repulsion at how there's like a lack of conscience in the bureaucracy that is so fully totalizing that you can't they can't get outside of it within their daily lives. And so I think, like, in some ways, like when you're looking at, how bad World War II was already by 38, that there was some urgency there, to instigate through, as I said before, like the stimuli of the images, and instigate a specific political behavior. And so, at that point, it's kind of like, how does it stand the test of time? I think, it was probably a good thing that we went to World War II, and we needed to persuade Northern Idaho equally to New York City, and these kind of, so like they figured out these cues, and they did it largely through these technical decisions, which is what you all probably talk about every week, in terms of like, how is it made? And so it's pretty much a marvel in that way, and that we're even still spoofing it in South Park. So I live, by the way, near Boulder, Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
We have Casa Bonita. I just want to say, I've been there.
So lucky.
Just for the record.
You lucky son of a gun.
Like a 900,000 person wait list, but
I
they
know.
actually, if you have a local address, they'll let you in sooner. So I actually just wanted this South Park just reference real quick.
I'm so
Amazing.
jealous. I've heard nothing but wonderful things about it.
It's it's average food, but then it's like really weird place, and then, so it's definitely worth doing, definitely. But so just to put a little, just to punctuate my point here, is that it is propaganda, and we can't call it journalism. And as long as we do that, did it meet its intended goal through the discoveries of behavioral research into audiences, and then the combination with, the classic film era, aesthetics, is pretty good at it, and it's very impressive historical piece.
So I will say, to be respective of time and all that, as much as we could have, I'll say, as much as we could have strangely talked about this 15-minute short for an extra hour or two. And quite frankly, again, as a fan of your book, Josh, I could have also listened to you just talk about the state of the history and evolution of American media for a while. But winding down, as we always do, Tom, how do you think The March of Time Inside Nazi Germany fared at the Academy Awards that year?
Nothing.
So you're right, because documentary categories didn't exist yet. However, here's an interesting fact for folks. The March of Time series did receive nominations for documentary short down the line. They were nominated for Norway in Revolt in 1941, Youth in Crisis in 1943, Atomic Power in 1946, and it also won was nominated for the collective best documentary for Africa: Prelude to Victory. Now, in theory, it could have been nominated for Best Live Action Short Subject to Reel that year. The nominees that year were Swing Time in the Movies, They're Always Caught, which is, Tom, you might know, one of my beloved Crime Does Not Pay live action shorts. Josh, have you ever seen the Crime Does Not Pay films?
I've never seen those.
Look them up. You can get a DVD of them from Warner Archive. They're basically like the 1930s version of McGruff infomercials, right? Where it's like cops warning you about dangers, but the acting and the scenarios they lay out are insane. One is just, mothers, be careful. Someone might put kerosene in the milk you feed your babies. Will they? Will they, though? So is that the winner in that category that year was The Declaration of Independence, which was just a live-action short recreating the signing of Declaration of Independence. And the Best Picture nominees that year, for context, The Adventures of Robin Hood, Alexander's Ragtime Band, Boys Town, The Citadel, Four Daughters, Grand Illusion, Jezebel, Pygmalion, Test Pilot, and the winner, You Can't Take It With You. So that gives you a real portrait of what that year was at the time Americans were seemingly just finding out at their local movie theater that those Nazi Germans, not great. Worrisome. Not great. Josh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, man.
For this conversation. I really appreciate you coming on for this.
Thanks. I had a great time.
And my apologies. My plan was to prop up the book behind me over here, but I just moved a little while ago, and it is in one of the boxes. And I don't know when the last time you moved was, but when you've got book boxes, it is hard. It's needle in a haystack with that stuff. It is it is really tricky. But I do want to encourage folks, in addition to all of the other stuff, to definitely seek out Shadow of the New Deal, because I thoroughly enjoyed that. But what else would you like to plug? What else would you like other folks to know about, to seek out?
So I'll say a couple different things. The first is, so I direct this thing for the Library of Congress called the Radio Preservation Task Force. We are about to lose all of American interview, town hall, call-in show, documentary evidence of localism history because of natural degradation of magnetic tape. People should be aware that, when you see Martin Scorsese, who works with the same people, I do with the film board, but on the audio side, saying we're going to lose all of the old films, from the nitrate, era and all these things, but even ones that just aren't being preserved. It is 10 times worse with radio for a number of reasons. So what I would encourage people to do is believe in the history of their local communities, and that the audio part of it has actually captured parts of local history that we don't have in print and we don't have on screens. So you get all these voices and all these people through radio history that you don't get through the other conventional historical means. So imagine if this great podcast was 100 years from now, 70 years from now, on a medium that could no longer be played in 2 years, and you had to race to the finish line to make sure it was preserved or digitized. That is happening and has happened to the entire American experience of radio. So it's really a problem because there's no consensus or infrastructure for it. In the history of this country, the Congress has earmarked $2 million for preservation. So $2 million, just for context, will probably preserve you somewhere in the range of, 8 to 12,000 hours, including labor of important material, maybe up to 50 if there's a good workflow, as they say in the archive world. But we have close to 800,000 to 1 million extant hours that should be preserved, in my opinion, after 12 years on this project. So that's it. So I think, it's great to talk about this film. This is a great show. But also I would just encourage our audiences to think about the other media and then how it similarly has captured imagination and American experience, and that it's basically almost gone. We got to do something. So just start thinking about it. Talk to your libraries. See what you all have at your local radio stations before they get bought by a new corporation, and then throw it all out. And that's it.
Great. And is there anywhere you want people to? This is a dicey game in today's world. Is there anywhere you want people to follow you, to follow your work, to seek anything out that you're doing beyond that?
Oh, sure. I've got a reasonably active Blue Sky account now. I used to be on Twitter, and I had a good number of followers on Twitter, where I post about a variety of things. So Twitter, I think they've changed the algorithms so that engagement doesn't work like it used to. So find me on Blue Sky, Josh Shepperd on Blue Sky, and I do post about film and media history quite a bit. I also post about policy, so it's boring, but I think it's important too. It's a little bit boring, but it's informational.
Well, Josh, thank you so much. I hope we haven't scared you off, because I hope you'll come back on the show in a future season, because I really enjoyed getting to do this.
That'd be great. Thanks.
But everybody else, stick around. We'll be right back with our picks for the National Film Registry.
The National Film Registry isn't some fixed object, frozen in time. It's always growing, adding new titles every year. These annual selections are made by the National Film Preservation Board, with members like Martin Scorsese, Alfre Woodard, and Leonard Maltin, and representatives from organizations like the Academy, the DGA, and the AFI coming together to debate and decide. But they don't just pull titles out of thin air. They pull from the public, people like you and us, who can submit their nominations for the registry in a form on the Library of Congress's website. What we do, at the end of each episode, is have Mike and Tom pick films not yet in the registry that they feel should be, inspired by that day's topic. At the end of each season, those films will be formally submitted to the National Film Registry for consideration on behalf of You're Missing Out. Here are today's picks.
So when I was going into this, I think, strangely, it was one of those things where ahead of my rewatch today, my registry pick was a little different. We're always trying to attach them to what we're talking about, and I think I was trying to find something that fit in line with the march of time as a whole, something that was analogous to the role that the March of Time newsreel series played over those 16 years. But then rewatching it today, I did find myself struck by the way that the film depicts Nazi Germany, and particularly, as we talked about in our discussion, the way that it curates its information to be targeted toward the average American, to be targeted not just in an abstract, here's what's bad about the Nazis, but specifically an idea of you don't want to live in Nazi Germany. How much it harped on these ideas of not being allowed to strike or ask for a raise. That line, the average worker at home forgets how much he is paying for his security. And so that changed it for me. That really captured my attention in terms of what this film did to speak to the average American and specifically go, buddy, you do not want Nazism here. I promise you. Don't buy their lies. It's not what they make it out to be. So I thought of another film that did that. And yes, my registry pick is a Disney film. But it's not a Disney film that you can stream on Disney Plus. It's one that they probably don't want people to stream because of what happens in it. But it won an Academy Award for animated short in its year, and it's honestly one of the most effective of the wartime propaganda films. I'm talking about 1943's Der Fuhrer's Face, which takes its title from a Spike Jones song of the same name from that time. A kind of comedy song spoofing the Nazis. If you've heard of it, it's probably because you've seen some viral TikTok or Instagram go, did you know in one short Donald Duck was a Nazi? And you can maybe misread that and think that means that it was pro-Nazi. It's very much not. Der Fuhrer's Face is about Donald Duck, one of the most beloved characters in America at the time, waking up in Nazi Germany and experiencing firsthand the oppressive life of a German under Nazi rule. It's not only significant because of the way that it shows this oppressive way of life, but I think it's also significant because, as the song that they depict goes, and the Führer says, wie is the Master Race, so we heil in the Führer's face. It's spoofing the idea of like, guys, it's not, it's not just a matter of like, oh, Nazi Germany is bad if you're not in the in crowd. It's also going, I promise you, it sucks if you're in the in crowd too. There's no part of this that's good for anybody. It's terrible. And to watch this beloved character, this beloved character for children and adults alike, suffer in Nazi Germany and ultimately wake up and be so glad that he lives in the good old USA. It's such a powerful and effective piece of wartime propaganda. It's an important reminder and it's emblematic of how these beloved fictional characters became pieces of wartime propaganda. Donald Duck was so instrumental to the war effort that he actually has a real naval record that you could look that up. It's insane. And listen, that was true of all of those cartoon characters. You can find Bugs Bunny cartoons, Superman cartoons, Popeye cartoons, all aimed at the war effort. The reason I'm picking Der Fuhrer's Face, number one, it's the most well animated of all of them. It's, from an animation standpoint, it's remarkably well done. Number two, how effective it is at propaganda. Enough that it wins the Academy Award, which is so significant. And number three, oh my God, if you watch some of those Superman and Popeye and Bugs Bunny cartoons from World War II, a lot of them are aimed at the Japanese, and they have aged horribly and were horrible then. And Der Fuhrer's Face probably has some of that, but not quite to the extreme those other ones do. So if you are going to pick a cartoon to preserve that represents the wartime propaganda effort, this is the one to go with for so many reasons. So my pick for the National Film Registry is Der Fuhrer's Face from 1943.
So with this one, I am going to make a bold pick. I'm I wanted to do something that wasn't going to fall into the Tom's Logic selections or a direct one-to-one, at least on its face, a direct one-to-one, but something that connects. And what we talked about in the episode and what you kind of just get into watching it on your own and formulating your opinions is the idea of propaganda. And how in this case it was a good thing, but how it maybe opened a Pandora's box. And we referenced that we're living in basically an age where this is just what every piece of news is. We don't have news media. I said we have propaganda media today. No matter which side of the aisle you're on, nothing is really playing things straight. There's always a bent. And a lot of that is due to, the erasure of the fairness doctrine, all of that. Talk radio was a big part of that too. Scumbags like Rush Limbaugh, may he rot in hell, helped radicalize a lot of the people in this country. But I think whenever you're going to talk about the news media in this country and what everything has gone towards, you're going to have to talk about Fox News and the horrible, rampant destruction it has rained upon the elders of our nation, boomers and the like, the people who thought that the internet would rot our brains. Although while we were watching people get executed in cartel videos when we were in the 7th grade, they were watching Fox News and their brains were getting turned into fucking scrambled eggs. And that's why we are where we're at. So thinking of all this, I made a bold choice, especially with some of the bold choices that they've been making with the registry in recent years, with shit like Happy Calloway's home movies, which will always be my go-to pick of absolutely insane things that they put in the registry, which I'm all for, by the way. But my bold pick is, I am saying that the first day of Fox News' airing in 1996 should be inducted into the National Film Registry. I can't pick anything specific out because, I don't have all of that data on me, and I think it would do a disservice to the entire point I'm trying to make and sort of the point that it being inducted into the registry would make, which is that, I had the exact date up. Do I still have this page up? No, I don't. All right. So it was a specific day in 1996 when Fox News launched, and that was the day you can mark it as the day that the slow death of news media was started. And, the 24 news media thing, just the rampant partisanship that ran through that fucking network, that still runs through this network, that so many people in this country cannot see through. And so much of it can be traced back to the explosion of propaganda from a movie like this that we covered today, or the Nazi Germany, Riefenstahl fucking propaganda stuff. Propaganda. This movie needed to be made, but it opened a Pandora's box, and out slithering from that box were the vile creatures that populated and still populate that cretinous fucking haven known as Fox News, and the never-ending destruction that it has laid upon our country that we are still dealing with today. So, bold pick, first 24 hours of Fox News' existence, I think, need to be in the registry because it is one of the darkest, most important days that we've ever had in the last 30 some odd years, and may not have known it at the time, but we look at it in hindsight, and yeah, that may be a more important day in the news media than 9/11 or the day we got Bin Laden. It's truly destructive, truly the tendrils of this fucking beast just never end. And yeah, that's my pick.
Next week,
we've recorded a commentary track for Douglas Fairbanks' silent swashbuckler, The Black Pirate.
You're Missing Out is a production of Neon Night Media. It's hosted by Mike Natali and Tom Lorenzo. The show is produced by Kyle Lampar and edited by Mike Natali and Kyle Lampar. More information about our hosts and guests are in the show notes. Thank you to Amanda Rush for our social media, and all of you for checking us out.
If you're listening right now or want to take the show on the go, every episode is available as an audio podcast. Follow You're Missing Out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, please leave a review and a rating. It helps folks find the show.
Want to watch the show or watch some of the films along with us? Great, that's why we're doing this. Don't leave us alone out here. Check out our YouTube channel. We've got video versions of every episode, uploads of some of the National Film Registry titles we're discussing, commentary tracks, and live streams. And once a month, I'll be uploading some content that's exclusive to the YouTube channel. So be sure to click subscribe and hit that little bell to be notified as soon as new stuff goes up. Because, let's be fucking real, I ain't sticking to a goddamn schedule.
So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
And we'll see you next time.
And you'll see us next time. Because we don't watch you, you're watching us.